Hi. Thanks very much for inviting me along. My name's Andy Brown, and I'm going to be talking about how to avoid your next software release ending in disaster. Okay, so I will start now. Um, but before that, I'd like to talk about this guy here, um, Pastrengo Reggiati, and he had a problem. The problem he had was that something was on the wrong side of his bed. And I don't actually have that problem. I usually have a different problem, which is that not something's on the wrong side of my bed, but actually somebody who isn't supposed to be in my bed has sneaked into my bed in the middle of the night, and I wake up and there's an extra one there, and here's the person there. But that's not the problem that Pastrango Ruggiati had. He had the problem that something was on the wrong side of his bed. Now, that was a problem because he was the captain of a 120,000-ton oil tanker, the Torrey Canyon, and the thing that was on the wrong side of his bed was a group of islands known as the Scilly Isles. And so he woke up this morning, he was heading northwards, and he expected to see the Scilly Isles on his right. But what he saw was the Scilly Isles were on his left. Now, this was a big problem for him because he was supposed to be at 6 o'clock, 1800 hours. He was supposed to be at Milford Haven because he needed to catch the 11 o'clock, the 2300 high tide. If he didn't catch that high tide, there was going to be a series of decreasing tides, and he may have to wait 5 days before he had another chance to get into port. Now, at that stage, he had two options. And the first option was he could reverse course and he could sail to the west of the Scilly Isles. His second option was he could sail between the Scilly Isles and the Cornwall. Now, if he took option one, that would mean that he was probably going to miss that high tide and he may be waiting up to 5 days and there'd be significant financial penalties. So he decided to go through this narrow channel. Now, when I say narrow channel, it was actually 7 miles wide. But it takes, with these super tankers, about 5 miles to stop and about 500 meters to turn through 20 degrees. So it's a narrow channel for a super tanker. And I said it took 500 meters to turn through 20 degrees. I'll talk a bit about the steering. So the steering was as follows. They had three settings. So one was autopilot, and then the autopilot was in charge. And what happened there was you just listen for clicks. And every time you heard a click, it had turned by 1 degree in a direction there. The second turning there was manual, and that was when you were in charge and you made the course corrections you wanted. And the third there was just disconnect, which they used for maintenance in port there. So that's the steering. Now, because they were going through such a narrow channel, they needed to get an exact position. And because they were traveling at 17 knots, which was fairly fast, they wanted to make a quick measurement. So what they did was something called bearing and distance, which is where you fire your radar at a known thing, which would be perhaps the Isles of Scilly. You look at the bearing, you can work out the distance from your radar return, and it's very fast. The problem is there's no safety check. So if you make a mistake, you don't realize it. Now, a better way of doing it is something called three bearings on three landmarks, where you triangulate. Because although it's slower, the advantage of that is if you make a mistake, it's very easily spotted because the three lines don't line up in a single point there. But they used this range and bearing, and they started going through the channel. As they're going through the channel, they then come across an unexpected problem, which is there are some fishing trawlers out and they've got their nets out. So the fishing trawlers, they can't maneuver. So this means that the super tanker then decides it's going to move out of the way. So it moves to the right like this. Now, that takes it closer to the reef. Now, what they do then is they realize that actually they've made a plotting error when they're trying to work out their position. So they quickly replot it and they discover that they're actually not where they thought they were. Instead, they're over here. They're heading directly for the reef, which is 2.8 miles away. They're heading at 17 knots. It takes them 5 miles to stop, so they can't possibly stop in time. And they're going to hit that reef in 10 minutes. So the helmsman makes a hurried course change. So if we remember, that means autopilot, they switch it into manual, make the change, and then they put it back into autopilot. So they do that. And they actually realize we're actually still going towards the reef. We haven't changed. So now they need to do an emergency auto change. So again, it's autopilot off, manual on, and then they replot their position. The captain goes into the cabin chart room to replot the position. The helmsman shouts out, "I can't hear the clicks," which means the ship isn't turning. But the captain, of course, can't hear him because he's in the chart room. But then the captain realizes he can't hear the clips. So they decide maybe the fuses on the steering mechanism blown. And this has happened before. So they open up the fuse box and they check. But the fuses are okay. So now they think maybe it's the oil pumps that move the rudder. And again, this has happened before. So the captain, he rings through to the engine room. Rings through, someone picks up the phone at the other end and he says, "Captain, your breakfast is ready." So in his panic, he's rang through to the galley instead of the engine room. So at this point, they look over and they realize that actually the steering mechanism is in disconnect. So they're not steering the vessel at all. So they quickly go to manual, they change it and they steer it as hard as they can. But all they can do is they can just watch as the reef gets closer and closer. And eventually they hit the reef. And then the largest environmental disaster up until that point in time then begins. Now, lots of mistakes happened in this, but the critical thing that I'd want to look at here is the actual initial decision to go through that narrow channel rather than reverse there. Instead of reversing there like that, going through the narrow channel. And so the question is, why continue with their plan? And this is a bias, and it's called plan continuation bias. And what it is, it's where we continue to follow a plan that's clearly falling apart and it's all just coming to pieces, but we keep on following the plan. Now, it's not just oil tankers like the Torrey Canyon captains there that follow this. It's actually a very common thing in aviation. And it's so common that actually they've written whole books around this here. So this is one here. It's about approach and landing accidents there. And in flight safety, they call it press-on-itis. And it's the fourth most common primary cause for fatal accidents in approach and landing accidents. So most accidents, they have more than one cause, but usually you have a primary cause. And it's the fourth most common, except if you're flying in the former Soviet Union, in which case it's the most common primary cause there. Now, examples in aviation would be things such as you not executing a missed approach. So you're coming into the landing ground, things are going wrong. You really should abort and you should do a fly around and come around again. But instead, you carry on and try and get it down on the deck there. Or maybe it's you ignore ground proximity warnings. They're telling you the ground is too close. Or you may press on despite the weather is getting worse and worse and you shouldn't be continuing there. So the question is, what's the relevance to software development for this? And the relevance is that software projects do exactly this as well. They will continue following plans after they are very obviously unraveling. And the one in particular that I want to look at there is in go live release plans. So actually getting it into live. Now, I used to work at HMV and basically we had this problem there. Now, the way things happened at HMV was HMV made all of its money at Christmas. Everyone went out and sort of bought records and DVDs and so on at Christmas. So this meant that all their profits were made then. So they didn't know how much money they had until the accountants had worked it out, which was around about April each year. And so at around about April, the funding for all the projects got released all at the same time in April. Now, the other thing as well was that, of course, because Christmas was so important, they had a hard code freeze at Christmas. So this meant that at the beginning of April, you had a whole load of projects all receive funding, all competing for resources. And they all started off, so it was resources, so the testers, developers, environments and so on. And of course, they were all going to finish around about the same time. So if you looked at the and expanded out that go live there, what you'd see is as follows. In October to November, we only had a few go live slots. So this was many years ago before there was you were able to release to go live very easily. And we had about two a week. So basically we were not allowed to release at the weekend because they didn't want their shops going having a problem when the developers weren't there. And we weren't allowed to release on a Monday night, because Tuesday was top 40 release day. So it left about 2 days a week, 2, 3 days a week. And so what would happen is all of these projects, they would assign themselves one of these go live slots. Now, what happened then was that one of the projects there, project one, it should have gone in by then, but actually it hasn't gone in. And what it does then is it then announces we're going to deliver late and we're taking this go live slot. And then this would cause a panic on project two, for example, who was also secretly running late, hadn't told anybody, and was also secretly planning to take that same live slot. So they would realize that wasn't available to them. And so then they would announce they were taking that one. And then this would cause a mass panic. The next one would do that. And then what you would have then was all the other projects would then scramble around trying to take these other slots that they were going to go for. There wouldn't be enough slots, so we would then have to create some additional slots there. Now, what we would also want to do though is we'd like to put some after the code freeze, but we were never allowed to do that because we'd done it one year and we've broken the system, so we weren't allowed to do that. So what you had then was all of these projects all going in one after the other there, creating immense pressure. So what you really want to ask also is what conditions are going to cause us to continue following a plan that's falling apart? What has to be present for that to occur? And basically, there's two things, or there's two areas. One's going to be the external pressures that are acting on people, and the second is internal factors. So external pressures might be a consequence of failure. What might happen if you fail? Another one might be you might underestimate the risks of continuing. You may have organizational and cultural factors. There may be industry rules driving you in a certain direction there. Internal factors are going to be things like your capacity to make decisions and work things through and have a mental model there. A second is your mental model itself. And a third thing would be your appetite for risk, how much risk you're prepared to take. And we need to understand how those factors result in a decision, but also we need to have some self-awareness and some honesty as well. So what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to look at something like the Torrey Canyon incident there and actually read through everything, understand it, and then honestly say, if I'd been that captain of that tanker, I probably would have made the same decision that he did. If you do not say that or cannot say that, then it means that really you don't understand the situation. In which case, if you don't understand the situation, you can't fix it. So in terms of external pressures, one would be that consequence of failure. So for the Torrey Canyon, the oil tanker, it meant significant financial penalties. And maybe the captain would get fired, which he didn't want to happen. If it's an airline, maybe if you divert to another airfield, you're going to have to put people up in hotels and pay them compensation. And for us at HMV, we were basically told, get that code in for Christmas. If the code isn't in for Christmas, maybe there isn't a job there for you in the new year. Another external pressure is that you may underplay or underestimate the risks of continuing. So for the oil tanker Torrey Canyon, they had a combination of a lot of unanticipated issues. They were going through a narrow channel, but they didn't anticipate the trawlers with their nets out when they were going through the channel. Whoops, they didn't realize they were going to make it a navigational error, and they didn't expect that they would get a whole series of steering gear issues. And similarly in aviation, often the risks aren't fully anticipated. And at HMV there, we didn't realize because each project was lying to us, unaware that all the other projects were also lying there. So another pressure can be this organizational cultural factor here. So one thing that happened was that the way that the oil was sold by the traders meant the tanker did not know where it was actually going until it got to this place here, the Canary Isles. And then basically it was told when it got to the Canary Isles to go in one of three directions. If they were told turn left, the oil had been sold in North America. If they were told go straight ahead, it had been sold in Europe, Northern Europe, and so they were going to either Rotterdam or Milford Haven. Or if they were told turn right, it had been sold to Southern Europe and they were going to go into the Mediterranean. Because they didn't know where they were going, they couldn't hold charts for every single possible destination they could be going. So they didn't have detailed charts for the Scilly Isles channel there. Other external pressures might be industry rules. So in aviation, it can be that you have to complete a flight within a prescribed flying duty period. And then that can cause you perverse incentives where you maybe try and make a dangerous approach and continue with it rather than flying around, clocking up too many hours, and then being put on a disciplinary for overdoing your hours there. Another internal factors, though, is your ability to make decisions at the time when you need to make those decisions. So for the captain of the Torrey Canyon, he had an almost impossible goal. So he had 5 days, 24 hours. He was sailing at 17 knots. See, that's if you multiply that out, that's 2,040 miles. But the distance from the Canary Isles to Milford Haven is only 2,000 miles. So there's almost no leeway there. So he had a very, very tight schedule. He was under a lot of strain. Um, and so another factor there can be fatigue. So very often when it occurs in aviation, it occurs at the end of a long flight or it occurs at the end of a long day of flights. For the Torrey Canyon, the captain, he'd only had 2.5 hours sleep. That wasn't because he was partying, that was because he was working so hard to keep on schedule. And at HMV, we were not allowed to start our go lives until 10 o'clock when the website traffic had quietened down. And then the go live started, and it was worked on by people that had been working since 9 o'clock that morning. So we were starting our go lives tired. So fatigue, it will do several things. It will impair your judgment. It will make you more ready to take risks. It will slow down your thought processes, your reaction time, and also it will impair your memory, so you don't remember stuff. Now, there's another factor as well, in that we find it very difficult to make decisions where we've encountered a sudden reversal. We need time to adjust. And that's precisely what happened with the captain of the Torrey Canyon. He woke up in the morning and he expected that he was going to be waking up to being here. But actually he woke up and he was here and suddenly had a huge problem and he couldn't cope with that. So that was part of why he tried to press on with it, because he didn't have time to adjust internally. Now, this happens quite a lot. It happens on projects. It also happens an awful lot in naval and military operations. So this here is a photograph. It's of the USS Yorktown at the Battle of Midway in 1942 there. And it's being attacked by Japanese aircraft at the time. Now, the Battle of Midway was an extremely large victory. It's an astounding victory for the Americans, and it was a devastating defeat for the Japanese. But it didn't need to be as devastating a defeat as it turned out to be. It became worse because of some decisions that the Japanese admiral made at the time. So what happened here was the Japanese, they wanted to lure the American fleet out into an ambush and then attack them there. And they knew that if they attacked this island, Midway Island, that the Americans would have to come out and defend it there. So they anticipated that in a surprise attack there, they would be just the airfield. There'd be no aircraft carriers. They would overwhelm the airfield, and then they could deal with the American aircraft carriers. Unknown to them, though, the Americans had broken the naval codes and they knew what the Japanese were doing. So they sent some carriers out to lay an ambush. So what happened was when the Japanese attacked the island at the beginning of the day, they then started to receive counterstrikes from the Americans. Now, some of these were from land-based aircraft, which they expected from the airfield, but they were being attacked by carrier aircraft as well. So they knew straight away that there was at least one or possibly more American carriers in the vicinity. But nevertheless, they successfully repelled all the attacks there until about 10:30 that morning. And then what happened at 10:30 was they received, in the space of 5 minutes, a devastating attack which put out of action three of their four carriers. Now, at this point, although it's a big disaster, it's not a critical one in that they've still got one carrier left and they have other carriers in Japan being repaired. So the wise thing to do at this point would be to recognize that you are overwhelmed, that your fighting ability has suddenly gone down, and to retreat. But the Japanese admiral, Admiral Nagumo, was unable to do that. He continued to attack, and the Japanese lost their fourth carrier there, and it turned into a big disaster for them. So another factor in an internal factor in your mind there is a switch in risk appetite. So when things are going really well, we are risk adverse. So we avoid taking risks unless the payoff is well worth it there. But when things are bad, we will actually deliberately seek out risks and we'll take a whole lot more risks. And when a plan suddenly becomes unworkable, our perception changes from good to bad, and all of a sudden we become a whole lot more risk seeking. So what happened here was that they were in the wrong position because the first officer, he had made some ill-advised course corrections during the night when the captain was asleep, and he'd done that discarding some safer alternatives because he was trying to to retrieve some lost time and get ahead of time there, and he was taking some risks there. Okay, so the question is, how can you avoid plan continuation bias? And here, remember, it's external pressures and internal factors. So you need to be able to change change those factors there in order to change the decision. If you don't change those factors, it's unrealistic to expect us to behave differently. So with the external factors, you can do things such as reduce the incentives for continuing to follow a plan. You can highlight the risks of continuing, like with this story, the Tory Canyon. If they'd thought about the steering mechanism problems they'd had in the past, they may have realized the risks. You could also perhaps highlight the culture and the management factors driving that. And for us at HMV, the seeds for our go live failure, they weren't sown in October, they were sown in April there, right at the start of the projects. And external factors would be you could introduce industry rules that would reduce things. That will work, but you may get some perverse incentives around the edge cases. Now, one thing that we could have done at HMV, for example, is we didn't know how much money the company had made until April, but we didn't know how many projects we were going to run, but we did know we were going to run at least one project. So it would be reasonable to have started off the first project before we knew how much money had been made, because they were going to do that anyway. And maybe when it became a bit clearer, then start off the second project. And this would have made an enormous difference to the end of the projects where the go live is going there by reducing that pressure. Okay, so the other things are internal factors. So you need to be able to preserve your mental and decision-making capacity for when you need it, which is when you're making that go live decision there. So you should avoid scheduling go lives when you know people are going to be fatigued because they are going to make poor decisions. We could have argued for beginning go lives at 6 o'clock, and perhaps we may have got it there. Also, if you have a mental model there, you can improve your mental model. So if you have a backup plan ready and things go wrong, you're more likely to follow that backup plan than if you have nothing ready. Also, avoid attacking the American fleet if they've just sunk 3 of your carriers, and try and have a circuit breaker period. If you've had something where you've suddenly got some really bad news or something that's completely thrown you and changed there, if you make a decision immediately after that, you will make a bad decision. So try and have a bit of leeway there to be able to make it, if that's possible. It's not always possible, but if it is, and you don't need to make the decision just yet, try and put it off. And risk appetite switch, do be aware that you're going to switch your risk appetite. Now, another thing that you can be doing is automated releases and DevOps. They will help. We reduce this planned continuation bias because everything's automated, but it will only help you so far. And it will introduce other biases, one of which is uh, if you have a highly automated system, when things go wrong in there, all of a sudden the work for the humans has become far more complex. And you also introduce some other biases such as automation bias. So thank you very much. Um, Please, let's do connect. So if you are interested in hearing any more, this is my email. This is my LinkedIn profile. Uh, and this is my YouTube profile. So thank you. And did we have any questions? Thank you.